common stock, I hope. Okay? What's in there that is important? Yeah, the Gordon growth model, right, which is, common stock should be very, very close to preferred, right? It's a dividend-paying security. We assume that the dividend lasts forever, the company lasts forever. But there's one huge difference, and this is kind of what Jason was alluding to, right? When we get into common stock, we have a dividend that sadly, for us at least, is not fixed. And in order to place a value on a share of common stock, we have to assume something about the growth rate in those cash flows that the investor receives. And that growth assumption is what we have to do. Sometimes we assume that growth will hold forever. Other times, as I know we went through, we can make an assumption that we'll have supernormal growth for some period of years and violate the model even, and we can still get away with it, right? Because we value everything based on what? Whether it's stocks, bonds, projects, as you can now see, we compute something and then we do what to those somethings?
Present value.
The present value of what?
Cash flows.
Right, remember cash flows. We don't care about net income unless it helps us get to cash flows, which in many cases it does, right? It's a beginning point, but that's the only time we're really concerned about it. So we look at the present value of a series of cash flows to value things. So it's incumbent upon us to try and come up with a reasonable growth estimate. And for a security that we expect to last for an infinite time period, we could come up with one growth rate for the first 5 years, another for the next 5 years, another for the next 10 years, and another one for year 21 and beyond. Perfectly legitimate, easily handled, but we have to assume a growth rate, right? Because we have to be able to mathematically identify what that dividend will be in any time period, or the mathematics of Gordon's growth model just falls apart. But again, can we handle it if the model's, what's the model's primary restriction? And it dies if it doesn't happen, if this situation doesn't exist.
G's.
Anybody? Chris? K must be greater than G. And again, whether you look at the mathematics of the original model or whether you look at D1 over K minus G, if G is greater than K, both of those things fail. And of course, they're the same thing. Okay, again, please understand that when we look at D over K for preferred stock, it doesn't look like we are taking the present value of an infinite number of dividends, but we are. We are, right? That D1 over K is simply a reduced version of the present value of a sum of dividends from now until infinity that are fixed. D1 over K minus G is nothing different than the present value of all the dividends for a share of common stock. Okay, I know I beat that to death in class, but don't misunderstand what we've got there. They're a tremendous benefit to us because they're a whole lot easier to work with, but they're showing us exactly the same thing. Okay, so we look at the present value of these cash flows. Common stock's a pain because D sub T could be anything. And so to get around that pain, and the only way to get around that pain is to assume something about growth. The economists taught us how to do that. You can't solve a problem, assume it. And, we do. And there is no other way to do it, right? What else about common stock? Can you have negative growth rates and dividends? Would you still buy the stock? Why? It still has cash flows, right? Remember, we take the present value of a series of cash flows to define value. If those cash flows are there, something has value, I don't care if they're going down. They're still not zero. Will they ever be zero?
This company goes belly up.
Yeah, but let's assume it doesn't, right? We always work under the assumption that a company's going to last how long?
Forever.
Yeah, because remember, D1 over K minus G, let's go back to the models again, is the sum of the present value of all the dividends from now until infinity. Okay, so if you're going to even touch D1 over K minus G, we have to assume that the company is still breathing. Okay, and will breathe and until infinity. So will those dividends ever reach zero? They get awfully close, right? But that's one of those asymptotic relationships that we talk so much about in finance and physics for some reason. Something approaches and approaches and approaches zero. You've heard this story, right? If you're standing at the end of a diving board and you always go halfway to the other side, will you ever fall off? And the answer is no. Unless your feet are as big as mine. At some point, you're going to lose them. Okay, but technically, you would never get to the end of the dive. For all practical purposes, yeah, you're going to get wet. What else in Chapter 8?
Are you gonna, is in the problems, or if you give us a problem with, you know, one of these common stock valuation things,
Which I will.
then will G be larger than K? Because I've got, you know, we can solve it using
Well, you
the
may,
earlier.
yeah, Jordan, good question. You may face one like we did in class that night, where for a short period of time, the model's requirements are violated. But again, and the reason I do that is to show you that, you know, even if it's violated and ultimately is unviolated, which I think in that example we did in class probably happened in year 3 or 4, because I generally don't stretch that out much further now, because it becomes busy work past about year 2, quite frankly. I want you to understand that again, 2 things. We take the present value of cash flows to compute value, and you could do it even if the model's parameters are violated for short periods of time, okay, a year or 2. So that is fair game, okay? Yeah.
I have in year 4 that it was raised to the 3rd power instead of.
Yeah, we'll
Why
talk
is
about that.
again?
We'll talk about that. That is correct. That is correct.
I was trying to remember what you
Yeah,
said.
well, we'll talk about that, because I do want to talk about that again very quickly. Okay. You gotta remember the relationship, right, is P0 equals D1 over K minus G. So whatever dividend you have at the top of that, you're down 1 to get to the time period that you're dealing with. So that was that, if you remember, the rule was violated for the first 3 years. G was greater than K. But from the 4th year dividend on, we were okay. K was greater than G, and we assumed to be fixed. So that was D4 over K minus G, which gets us to P3, just like D1 over K minus G gets us to P0. In other words, we're going to the end of the year prior to the dividend being paid, in all cases. So if we had the 10th year dividend, it would be the price, it would give us the value of the security at the end of year 9. That 1 to 0 is always held, right? We'll talk about this. We'll look at it. Because that model will come up. What else in